ways that you can provide this CO2 to the plants, okay, that all of you can do and make. Foundation came out with that little air spinner, so it just attaches anywhere and you fill your GANS in there and it just rotates with the wind and creates that environment. So that is something that you would put so that it's anywhere above your plants, okay? Because it's just creating that environment, but you still need something underneath because you want to connect that with that with that so that you have a nice flow between all of them. You can use those, say that's why we created the 3 products for the root, for the seeds, and for folio spray. Now what we do is we soak our seeds and then we just we folio spray all our seedlings and then our plants at least once a week as well. And we've also got in our system GANS bottles in our water and it's everywhere.
But
Can you
it's
go faster with that process?
They
not necessarily faster.
necessarily faster, but we're getting the vibrant colors, the flavors,
The toughness, the leaves are
thicker leaves, they're much more tougher, so that's why we get the longer shelf life. We haven't developed or gone to the understanding of getting bigger, growing bigger plants because we don't understand enough yet. Because if you think about, we're dealing with Earth's fields, okay, so if we had to create the right GANS mix above a plant, that would almost fend off the sun's fields, we could create taller plants because a plant can only grow as tall as it can interact with the fields up against the pressure. So if we release or make that pressure less, it can grow taller, and that's where you get your bigger plants. Yeah, it's like a you create a dome, like a greenhouse environment where things grow better because it's, you're creating this nice cozy environment. But a greenhouse is now, when you understand how the plants are interacting with the fields, that plastic of your greenhouse acts as a barrier to a lot of your fields. So you almost don't want a plastic greenhouse. Yes. Yes, I mean we use a lot of ormus or sea GANS in our products because from the sea GANS from the ocean you're getting mainly calcium, magnesium in the right ratios with a lot of other minerals. So all you're doing is you're making that available for the plants. It's still in a matter state, but when you do add it into your soils, you've got your moisture in the soils, you've got salt in the soils. So what you're doing then is you're slowly turning that matter state into a GANS a lot quicker, allowing the plants to use what they need as a GANS state. So it does work very effectively.
But the ormus is not on its own. It's
No.
not as effective as with the GANSs.
Yes.
Because we tried that, because we had ormus long before we had the GANSs.
So we mix the ormus with our CO2 with amino acid in that, so that it creates
Full spectrum.
full connection when you mix it all together. So that when you are, what happens is that amino acid, and we do still have a bit of salt in our mixture. So when you have your amino acid, COH and N, it will connect with, say, your calcium, okay? And then you're creating that structure, just like in our body. The amino acid with your calcium forms your bones and that sort of thing. So then when you give this to your plants, it immediately can take up that calcium because it connects, your amino acid connects with the plant's amino acids, and then it can take the fields of your calcium. straight away.
You, regarding like geographic stress areas in the land, have you found that it sort of neutralises that out in curry lines and banks
Yeah.
and that sort of stuff?
It's the energy.
Yeah, we had a chap that we did some work with. He's from Austria, and he's been doing this for the 20, 30 years. He does it for corporates where he goes in and looks at the Earth's energies. And what we found is Lee will take the pendulum and you take a specific GANS, and the pendulum will tell you where that GANS wants to go, because that GANS links up with a certain energy structure of Earth at that point and magnifies. So yeah, placing your GANSs on certain points will definitely help. And to then circumvent a lot of different energies that sometimes you get in fields where stuff just doesn't want to grow because of, and it's more not so much the soil, you get different patches all over. It's more the deeper energy structure under the earth, which is creating a different fields coming up, which the plants don't like and can't grow in. And so over time with the GANS you are creating a different environment, allowing that plant to then grow in that area which it doesn't normally like to grow in. So yeah, it's this technology will work well with mixing in that sort of understanding of the ley lines with energy, earth's fields and stuff like that.
But we've got to understand that you can't go to handle this, because you can inadvertently, as Kesh says, you want to stop a hurricane coming with your GANSs, it's going to divert that hurricane to somewhere else to mess somebody else up. You've got to understand what you're doing, and you don't necessarily want to completely destabilize patterns on the earth. We've got to work with that and in harmony with that, and just come to an understanding.
I can give a testimonial here if you'd like to hear a little story about my mulberry tree.
Yes.
I'll come up and do a little scribble under here. So those that know my original property, I had a huge mulberry tree, and the sun arc was roughly sort of like going that way across the sky. So the leaves had shaped themselves to get the maximum from the sun on the arc. When I set up in my property, I built my health unit, the plasmatron, and that was roughly, say, here. And it had a variety of spinning balls with mainly carbon and the oxygen and the zinc fields. But I also had a magrat there. So the plasmatron was only turned on at certain times of the day, so the field strength would be weak and then it'd become really big and then it'd go back to being weak again. But the magro was on all the time. And it was creating a huge auric field there, a plasmatic field. So what happened was the plant, the mulberry tree, said, oh wow, I can feed off this, and this is better than the sun. So it struck a branch off here, and it started growing towards the health unit. 10 metres it struck it out. It was bending down to the ground. It was trying to crawl into the room. The other thing that we noticed was that the leaves on this side of the plant all turned, instead of facing the sun, they were now facing the magrat. They turned around, they were ignoring the arc of the sun, because this was a field strength that was feeding them quite well all the time. The other thing we noticed, that yes, it did increase the yield, and say this was a normal mulberry leaf, the new leaf was 2 to 3 times bigger. And in autumn, it was still brilliant green. So what Jimmy was just saying, you have to know what you're doing, because basically the tree now had a sun in full strength all day, all night, and every day of the year. So the seasons had changed. There was no variation in field strength. It was constantly turned on. And so the leaves stayed brilliant, bright green all year, and all facing that wall, whereas the other half, the plant on here, went through its normal autumn cycle. It was very strange to see. And what's more, this side was producing fruit at different times of the year. So you've now upset the whole balance of nature by bringing in this artificial sun and having it turned on all the time. Just like some plants get very confused being around footy fields, they have the bloody lights on all the time. So you have to be very aware of the field conditions that you're changing, because you're now changing things for that plant in its normal life cycle. It's like, oh, I'm on coffee all day and I've got all this energy and I'm going for it. And it's starting to happen with the mulberry tree on my new property. I've got just a couple of little bottles, but I've got fruit now. How many people know mulberry trees fruiting in January, February? Yeah, well, you've got plasma everywhere too. So it's a little anecdote, and we'll let you get back to it. So you can see all the photographic records on the Golden Age of GANS. It's all documented there. Just search through my name and go back and you'll see everything.
When we did the vineyards this last year, we just made little bracelets. So it's just 6mm tubing, and we just filled it with, you can see a bit of the GANS and water, and I hung those around every plant, every vine, for the 2 rows. But what you have to realize is as well is, so there's my 2 rows, and there's my plants. I made 2 mixtures, 2 different mixtures. So I'll put one there, and then one there, and one there of the one mixture, and then the others was the other mixture, because you create a flow constantly, this interaction between all of it, so that along the whole 2 rows you're creating this dome. So you can do small ones around the vines. You can get tubing from Bunnings, plug the ends and fill it with GANS, and then you can just tie them around bigger trees. And try and put, with trees, at least put 2 or 3 in, because we also did that one where we had an old apricot tree.
An old apricot that was
tree.
very unhappy.
Very old, and so we put a ring around one of the branches, and it grew. It was happy it grew, but then it got so big, and then we had big wind and storm, and
It was
broke
slightly
off because it was too heavy.
and
Because
so
it
it
was,
fell over.
was
But it
out of balance.
gave it a new lease of life. But yeah.
So you try and create at least a bit of a balance in your tree. If it's got 3 main branches, and you try and put on the 3.
You said you put 2 kinds.
I just mixed the ratios. So, you know, I would have had CO2 and CH3 and zinc, and then I just created different ratios. So it might be 10 ml of CO2 in one mix and maybe 5 ml of CO2 in the other mix. So just that slight difference creates the flow to happen between the 2. A gradient, yes. And you can do it either by changing the amount of CO2, or if you're mixing it with water, just the volume of water. You know, so you mix your GANS with 100 ml of water, and your other mix, same GANS, but with 200 ml of water. And so you just create that little difference. So, yeah, big trees, you can do this. It's a bit tedious to go up and climb your trees, and if you've got 1,000 acres, 1,000 trees of but you do it once. So that's one way to play around in your garden. You know, you can use the small bracelets. The other way for more indoor ornamentals is we created these nice little glass balls that we filled with the GANS and a gel, and then you can just plant that into your pot plant. And we like these ones because when you do that, you're feeding the root system as well as above. And these ones, for example, are plastic ones, and so the whole idea with the 5 is you place them around your garden, So that's your little garden patch. Maybe put one there, one there, one here, one there, one there, because they all flow, all the fields will flow between them, and so then you starting to create over time a nice big dome of fields around your garden to allow the plants to grow better, flourish. So you can do it this way. You can fill ping pong balls and hang them in your trees. You can put little bottles and bury them in the ground, anything.
Now these little ones you can put in the bottom of your pots and raised beds or whatever as well. You put them as rings, or you can lay them
The bottom of
at
your
the
pot
bottom
plants,
of the
pots.
pots, straight pots, depending on. The trick is with plasma is, you just start adding and dotting, and the more you add to your environment, the more fields that flow, the bigger difference you'll see in your plants. But just understand that you're not going to suddenly see, you're going to see weird things that you wouldn't normally see, but you've got to be really observant to notice, because you're not always aware of what came before. So it's really good to look at your garden beforehand and go and say, all right, this bush had that size leaves, and even take a lot of photos, and then do all of this, and then give yourself a season and watch as to what's happening.
But your bird life, your insect life is all going to change in your garden.
Is there a certain field area that all that size will cover? Like, would there be an optimal?
Yeah, I've got it in here. I think it's 1.5 meters or 3 meters.
1.5
1.5 away from each other. If it's too far, because then as the fields are moving, they get weaker and so on. So you wanted to create a bit of a nice tight niche. They're ideal for little gardens, little townhouse gardens and this and that. If you've got a very big garden, just use the GANS, put it into little bottles, and then just go and bury them all over the place, and say, hang bottles in your trees or ping pong balls, anything.
The stronger fields are created when you spin something. That's why that nice little thing, the unit for the spinning in the wind, is great, because that will throw the fields further than if you've just got a plain hanging ball, for example.
But the static ones, because over time those fields build. And as they build, they also start pulling in more of those fields from out there, and so it just becomes a.
And if you're then watering in a lot of like the GANS that we got there, and you're using it in your mixture and you're watering, all those tiny little GANSes are now interacting with every ball that's in your garden, and so you're creating more of a flow.
So that's essentially how you then, create your oasis. So it's first of all, plant lots of different plants, and then you can play around with the GANSes in any which way you like. It's up to your own imagination how you want to house them, whatever you have, and just put them all over your garden. Bury them and hang them, put them in little ornaments, whatever. It doesn't really matter, just so that you just position them around your garden, in the soils and above, so that you're also creating that height effect.
Christmas tree.
Yes.
All year round.
So it's as simple as that, to start creating a very nice environment, which when you walk into that, you are also receiving a lot of energy from then your garden with all the plants, and at the same time you're also giving. And then it's more for your plant life, your insects, your bugs, everything else that's going to come to your garden.
And
Questions?
When you start doing that and you find there's a lot of peace in your garden and a lot of nature, that's when I found I could literally, start calling to the king parrots, and they'd come and want to sit on my hand. Very special. But I think it's because of that environment that you create, and then that intention you have, and you start interacting very heavily with the nature, and you come into kind of a good place with it, so that you can start interacting with your little friends as well when you've got that stuff in your garden.
you build up, especially if you also use the CO2 and you're using zinc, because as we all know, zinc helps with our emotion. There's also a connection with the plants, with the zinc. So when you add CO2 and zinc in your environment, you're helping yourself emotionally just as much as everybody else. So it becomes your little refuge.
And anybody who's made the Cup of Life #1, the reason you can use some of that with your plants and interact with it with your plants is because the Cup of Life one, with the way it's set up, it also creates magnesium. So it will also help to feed your plants on magnesium. So you can also try and play a little bit with that.
No, a touch of copper, because copper traditionally is used as a antibacterial, antifungicide in the matter state. So all plants do have copper in them, a touch of copper in them. So, but it's not one that they need. Funny enough, Kesh was saying, which I'm still trying to get to the bottom of, understand. He said the plants attract the bugs, the insects and infestation is because they're lacking copper. And so we've started playing around with, because you can also use copper to drive away insects.
And it's also an algicide.
Yes. So there's a whole other,
Anti-inflammatory as well.
yeah. So we're playing with that. So. Yes. The plant's lacking, so I don't know whether it attracts the bug because the bugs have copper in it. So there's the field transfer between the bugs to the plants. So the plant gets what it wants, copper or what. So
What he also said, which rings a bell in my brain, is they said that the copper gives them like muscular twitches and stuff. They don't like it.
oh, that's the insects.
That's to the insects. So maybe because the plant doesn't have enough copper, it might not have that effect. Whereas if we add that effect, it gives it the heebie-jeebies and off it goes. Yeah.
Any ideas on weed control?
Weeds are good. They're your best friend. It's just another plant, but in the wrong place. Hey?
Indies.
Indies. Well, they all serve their purpose.
What do you do, Tom?
They teach you how to dance and stand up.
Stop you walking on the grass and you grow stuff.
When you look at especially degraded fields, and the first thing that comes up is weeds, and a particular type of weed. And why? Because that environment needs that plant. Weeds are generally very high in minerals. So there was a guy, a farmer, I read a book 8-9 years ago, he's somewhere in New South Wales, and what he did was he regenerated his field by allowing that weed to grow. So he says the first year he had just had one type of weed. Then he said then he just used to go in there and just mow it down and leave it, Then the second year he said he started getting that weed plus another 1 or 2 different other types of weeds. And so this took several years, and then you had lots of weeds coming up, and he just left them and mowed them down and let them fall on the ground. And then eventually they all just disappeared, and he never got the weeds again. So all that the weeds were doing were rehabilitating the soils, because the different types of weeds we know then would pull in the different fields. It's all massive GANS matter, the plants, which then go back into the soils. The plants, through their roots, are feeding all the different soil biology, bringing in new biology, and so on and so on. So after a couple of years, he had really fantastic soil. But he had to work through and allow nature to do its thing with the weeds.
And then the normal paddock grass came back.
Yes.
And the correct kind of paddock grass, and some of them apparently even like old style that they hadn't seen in the area for many years.
For 100 years have come back.
Came back.
So it's just changing that, you change that environment which allowed that particular grass to regrow. You know, so from 100 years
Can I
ago.
add to that?
Mm.
Peter Andrews
That's
says
his
the
name.
same thing about growing the weeds as the first step to do it, right? And a word of warning, don't let the agricultural department know because they tried to sue you for growing the weeds.
Yeah, he's the guy who did it years and years ago.
Yeah.
But see now, you know, to him he did it and you could see it worked.
Yes.
Now we can understand why. And it's perfect, what he's done. But he's also ridiculed and considered a nutter in farming world.
Again, that's just that. The thing that he did on his property was that it didn't have rain for 2 years at all. The farmers at England were against him,
Yes.
right, for growing all the
Weeds,
weeds.
yeah.
He also blocked his river with branches and created billabongs.
Yeah.
Then he grew alfalfa after the weeds, and then he got fantastic crops because the water level went up.
Mm.
And 2 years of no rain, the farm down from him had water flow in a creek that had no rain
Yeah.
from up there and no rain from that end. Then they started asking him how he did it.
Well, as we said earlier, the plants create the environment to create the moisture, whether it's in the soils or wherever else. So, you know, we miss so much.
It's possible. He's being ridiculed this way.
Yeah.
And
I'll cut to you, Bill.
Just clarifying, so if we're putting in bottles of ping pong balls, are we putting pure GANS, or are we making ratios with water added to
Yeah,
it?
you put some, you don't need a lot of GANS. You know, in a ping pong ball, you might just need, say, half a mil of the actual GANS with water.
Okay.
Spinning.
And then,
Talking
well,
about the
that-
spinning of the water.
So you just then can create different ratios. If you're going to create 20 ping pong balls, you just make up 2 or 3 different mixes and then just fill your balls and then know which one's which and then you go and spread them around.
So then the second question is, you know, we make up like CO2 GANS, we can take a tablespoon off and drink it. Could I take some of that water off and spray the leaves on a foliar, spray the top of the leaves?
Yes, I found that I need, the water works, but you then have to, if you're just using the water off the top, but then you have to spray off. And what I do with that folio mix is there's GANS in there, so you are spraying, it's a small amount of you that you're using, but you are spraying the actual GANS, because my logic says, well, if I'm spraying my whole farm and plants, those GANS particles are going to land on the leaf and the ground around it and everywhere, and so they're going to be there for a very long time. And they are themselves, the GANS particles act as little magnets pulling in more fields.
We
So
found that plain
I
water
found
lasts
it-
about a week and then the energy's gone and things start
Yeah.
collapsing a bit.
So I find it better to actually use the GANS itself when you spray. You know, the water works. You know, if you've got a little garden patio and stuff like that, yeah, by all means use the water because you're there almost every day watering. But when you're looking at a bit of a farming commercial scale, it's you want to do it as minimum as possible, but most effective. And so I would recommend using the GANS on a farm scale.
And the leaves, spray the leaves and let that die and go into the
It just goes into the ground, yes. Yeah, you don't take anything away. You see, and that's when you see all these farmers that rip up everything and take everything away. It's crazy.
You know, you've got to think, as a farmer, one has now got to think of no-till. You've got to think of, you know, allowing things to go back. Whatever you're not pulling out for commercial purposes has to go back into the land, and it starts a whole regeneration cycle.
You've got to give back. To me, you've got to give back 3 times as what you take. And at the moment, we take 3 times as much as what we give back.
there's an anecdote of the wrong thing to do. In Rock Valley, in Lismore, there was a farmer, an old Italian guy, who was a lazy bugger. So he started getting a few weeds in his property, the cotton or whatever they call those big fluffy things. So he would torch it, set fire to it, raise it to the ground, it would just be black and ash. Now, all around were healthy paddocks, I never did anything like that. But this guy would torch his weeds. Next year, be twice as many weeds growing. The third year, more weeds. By the 4th year, I saw the entire field was just full of these weeds.
and he would still keep burning them. He just didn't understand. He was destroying his soil bacteria with the heat. He was losing a lot of ash and water runoff and all sorts of nutrients. But he didn't understand that by burning his weeds and taking them back to ground level, he was making the worst field conditions for a healthy paddock.
It's all these little things. If you understand the science, we know what we're doing now. And so we can think things through and say, oh, this is the best method for me, because every one of our farms are going to be different. But if you understand what you're doing, you can adapt and do what suits you to using this technology. Whether you're using the GANS or just using the knowledge of the plants themselves to rehabilitate your soils and stuff. So.
You know, we try
Gil?
and teach. Sorry.
Wait, Gil?
Yeah, no, I remember hearing a testimony you gave on the internet regarding the when you had really hot temperatures and the heat and frost wasn't affecting your crops. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we had our summer months when our lettuce growing, especially when we had to go through the periods of 40 degrees, lettuce just wilts, even though they are floating on rafts in water. And then when we used the GANS, we just put the GANS bottle in our water. The plants were fine. They were not wilting or flopping over, perfectly fine in that hot sun. And all we're doing is, even though we had the GANS in the water, it was a massive amount of water, so it created its dome around the plants, so that the plants, it was almost creating this type of a shield against the really intense fields that was created from the interaction of the sun. And that's how then the plants can survive and grow in really hot, harsh conditions, because we're creating a nice environment around them. And the same in the snow. The Chinese have done GANS around plants in the snow, and then they had a big amount of snow, and it didn't kill the plants. They still survived when the snow melted, because the plants were still able to feed off the GANS even though it was under the snow, and so they survived. So
Winter tomatoes.
yeah, we grew tomatoes through winter.
You know, you have to work with the season though,
Yeah.
because we grew the tomato plants, so the stems and the leaves and everything grew. The flowers came very early in the spring, and then the fruit came as it warmed up through the early spring.
Yeah, we had huge tomatoes in October. We were eating and picking. And then, because I was spraying almost every week just with the water, GANS water. And then we were getting the hot period. We had a hot period of 40 degrees. And I thought, well, it's summer. Tomatoes like growing in summer. So I stopped spraying. And within a few days, they had
Everything just burnt.
all burnt and died. Because that environment that I'd stopped spraying, so they were used to a certain environment with certain fields, and I stopped spraying and we had a different environment, and the leaves couldn't feed and cope, and so they just...
So you have to keep up those conditions.
Yes.
To be consistent.
Yeah, and that's why you're using the different devices that you can just hang around, because then it becomes a more of a permanent field interaction that you're creating over and above your spraying. You know, we have quick crops, lettuce, so we like to spray. If you've got a really long crop, annual, seasonal crop, you will approach it differently. So everything's different.
This is changing from the plants to the human. Earth and nighttime, carbon and the oxygen that we're breathing. Those that work in night shift or living in a room where we've got out-street lighting, where we're creating light, where does that fit in with us then?
I can't answer that question, but I'd imagine it has a certain effect on us. Because when you look at that, the basic amino acid structure in the center creates the free plasma, which is our emotion. Okay, so Generally, we sleep at night to rest and recharge. Okay. But if we're changing that environment, we might be changing the way our body interacts with these fields, which then would affect our emotion. Because if we change any one of these, our emotion would change. And I'm sure there's probably lots of studies with people doing night shift and other funny shifts where long-term, emotionally, they are quite impacted. So yes, it would have an effect, I think. Any other questions? We had one there.
Jim, could you just elaborate with back to our star formation diagram? When you refer to free plasma in the centre of that star shape, as opposed to our general description of the flow of mangrove fields, why do you differentiate, and exactly what do you mean by free plasma?
These four plasmas, so they're all individual plasmas, okay? All giving off fields. When you have two of them, they're going to interact, okay? And then you're going to have a central point where those fields start interacting. You're going to have the same situation with this one, and then this one, and this one, and so on. But now, this is a concentration of fields, okay? This where they interact. Now that is also interacting with that and that, but eventually you're creating one in the middle. And that's the interaction of all of them and creates what they call free plasma, because it's created from the others, okay? And that in our amino acid structure is where our emotion sits. Light is a maggrav, so no, it's not a free plasma. It's a field that has both magnetical and gravitational properties.
Whereas that plasma, I mean, it brings to my mind analogies with, people talk about 0 points and null points and things like that.
Well, that's your 0 point.
Yeah.
It's what terminology, but then all that interaction creates one in the middle. That's your free plasma.
So the free plasma has energy?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's a non-tangible energy. That's why we don't have an organ for our emotions. We have a lung, heart, and everything else, but where does our emotion sit? It's in every DNA, every cell with a free plasma. That's where it sits. Collectively, they create, because we have trillions of cells, so collectively they create our emotion.
Yeah, because earlier on you mentioned how every cell has plasma.
Yes.
Only one point.
Yeah, this in itself is one plasma, and even though they are individual entities and creates its free plasma there, it itself is a plasma which has its own properties.
So does the sun have free plasma at the center? Like the sun have free plasma at the center?
Well, at the center of everything is your soul, or your principal field. It's the source. The free plasma is created from the interaction of two sources. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Sperm and an egg, and you create something else. Yes.
So it's no living matter free plasma.
Does?
Is free plasma only found in living matter, or is it found in inert substances?
It needs four, and generally, I'd imagine only in a living organism, because you need four.
Oh, the plasmatron.
Eh?
The plasmatron makes the free plasmas, don't it?
Yeah. Yes. It's a creation. Yeah.
But it's only lasts
Yes,
as
Jeff.
long as your things are on.
That's right.
So if it creates its own heartbeat, it would create itself.
Regarding your distance, has had nothing growing for many, many years. It rains. All of a sudden you have a lot of growth happening out.
Yes.
When they check the sand, there's absolutely no sign of any seeds.
Yeah.
They're disintegrated gone. So I don't know how that happens, but I thought that. So where does the plasmic field or life field go after a seed disintegrates? Does it stay in the sand and maybe has an effect on the silica of the sand so that can be reproduced with the right conditions?
That's where it gets a bit woo-woo, because Kesh says it's this, in the desert when you have your sand and then it rains, it creates a certain condition for a plant to grow. But even though there might not be a seed there, there's an energy structure of that seed there, and so when the right conditions are there, it will grow. That seed will manifest and grow. It's the same explanation when the paddock, there was not that grass for 100 years, and there was probably not a seed of that grass there. But the conditions that were created in that field were exactly right, because there was already an energy structure of that plant, because it had grown there before. That would be your principal field. That's what's in the center. And it creates the right conditions for that to manifest itself and show us as the plant. Same as fish that in a pond that's been empty for 100, 10, 20 years, it fills up with water, all of a sudden it's a fish. Same thing. They're there energetically as a principal field, and then that principal field, when it interacts with a certain environment, it creates that, comes into balance and creates that magrab, or what we see visually, because it now matches with our eye strength, and so now we see it. So there will probably be plants all around us that we just don't see but are growing there. Does it explain? Yeah. Anything? Was it useful?
Yes.
Okay. So this time next year, I expect to see photos of all your oasis gardens. And then there's no excuses.
And you will explain how we did it.